Hello, Falcha. It's Liam Printer here from the Motivated Classroom. So I wanted to share with you this first activity. These are little teacher tips that I'm going to be sharing on YouTube as much or as frequently as I can. So this first one is think about if you were trying to do some kind of past tense activity, or you want to do an acquisition based activity around an interesting story, with the goal being that they can understand the past tense and maybe start to use it, but also, of course, like all acquisition, try and pick up some new words and some new bits that they're ready to use themselves. So what I did was I just come back from holidays, and I was really jet lagged actually. So I was extremely tired and didn't have a huge amount planned. So what I decided to do was tell them about my holidays, but I wanted to make it an interactive and an interesting way to do it. So very, very simple activity. All they need is a set of mini whiteboards and maybe their notebook to write on. That's it. So how I did it was I got each of them had a whiteboard, and I explained to them that I'm going to talk to you about my holidays. Now one of you in each, so they're in pairs. So in each pair, one of you can write down the numbers that I say. You don't have to, but you can. And the other person can write down only names and places. So you can only write down, for example, if I say Boston, or if I say John, then you can write those down, and that's it. So that's all that they were listening for. And I explained you're going to try and recreate or reconstruct my story using this information to help each other out. So then I timed myself, and for 2 minutes I would talk about my holidays, and they just had to listen. They could ask some clarification questions if they wanted to, but simply it was listening. And of course I told it in the past tense, but to their level, slowly and clearly. I did some drawing on the board to try and make it a little bit like story listening. And at 2 minutes, my alarm would go off and I would stop. And then at that point, they would orally try and speak to each other about what I had done. While they were doing the oral part, I was writing up on the board key verbs that they may use to communicate. So things like in Spanish, fue a, he went to, conoció, he met, olvidó, he forgot, vio, he saw. So the things I'd mentioned that I thought would be useful, and just the verb on the board. So they now had the number, they had their places and people, and then they had some of the key verbs, and they were trying to do this just orally. And we continue this process maybe 3 or 4 times, and they could ask questions in between. And once we got to about 10 minutes of this, now they had to try and write in as much detail as they possibly could using the two whiteboards and clarification questions with each other in bullet points as much as they could about my trip. Now, the reasons for this there's many reasons. One, really detailed active listening is a hugely important thing of acquisition. So they were listening really actively to what I was saying and trying to understand and remember it. The second thing is they were communicating and collaborating, which we know is really good for the relatedness part of motivation, working with each other, and competence, because they were learning from each other, making sure, checking details, they were helping each other out. And we know from the cognitive science that yes, acquisition comes naturally when we listen to things and when we read things, but really in order to learn things, we need to think about it, and we should be made to think hard. So you could see every time when I paused, they were really thinking and looking at the board and be like, what was it about number 2? What did he say about 2? Oh yeah, he took 2 trains. He took 2 trains. That's right. And then they were saying this back and forth to each other. They were using, depending on the class, a mixture of Spanglish or mainly Spanish, depending. I was encouraging them to use as much Spanish as they could, of course. And I was walking around while they did this, doing what's called active observation. So I had a little set of post-it notes, and I was quite simply writing down things that I was hearing that either were really good or things that I was expecting to hear that maybe they weren't using. So if I was expecting to hear olvidó, he forgot, and I've been to 3 groups and none of them have seemed to have mentioned that in their conversations or in the writing part afterwards, then I'm going to talk about that afterwards. In the same way, if many of them had said fue a and they used the word estadio for stadium, I'll tick 4 groups who used estadio. I think they've got that now, and I mentioned that afterwards. It's called active observation. It makes you focus on things rather than just circling and thinking about the next activity. Okay, very simple, really good. They loved hearing about it. Of course, it's much better if there's an interesting part to your story, of which mine did, and it's a true story about going to an NBA game in the US, and some interesting things did happen, which made it really quite interesting for them. And of course, then we did the connections part of who else likes basketball. Has anyone ever been to a stadium? Which stadium have you gone to? Have you ever watched another sport? What sport would you like to go and see? Learning about each other. And then we use that information to write on each other's page. So we have a page for each member of the class. So John has already been to a game in Finland. Michael has never been abroad, but he went to a football game here locally. John was on 3 trains as well over the break. And we're learning and learning and learning. And then, of course, in the next class, I will turn that into a reading for them. So I'll take up what they've written. It helped for me to remember what I said. And I'll type it up into a very basic reading that we will use in the next class. So super simple. No recursos, that's from Spanish, recursos. No resources needed except you, a couple of mini whiteboards and their notebook. Loads of active listening. If you want to introduce like a little brain break to it, which I did, and as good as getting them to stand up and then at one of the breaks of me speaking, so it was in 2-minute slots, getting them to stand up, and then I would say something from the story and they had to mime it or act it out, or they would say to each other one of the words or the numbers that they'd written down and they had to act it out. So maybe they said the word 15, they might have to go like, and they'd say, oh, 15, and then the other one would be, he'll act out one of the words on his page. Something like that to try and get them to think deeply about the material. But they were picking up loads of new words, lots of new vocabulary, phrases, seeing the words, using it, communicating. It was wonderful. It worked incredibly well and took almost the entire 45-minute period. And they wanted to know what happened next. I left it on a couple of cliffhangers like, oh, you'll have to listen tomorrow as to what happened in the next day on my trip. I also had some photos from my trip that I could share at various key points, and I put those up. To develop it and make it better for next time, I think what I would change is I would have my story from my trip. I think I would have written it down, or at least had a basic parts, because me being me, I ended up just kind of going off on tangents and talking too much about other things. And actually it would have been better to focus on the main points of the story, particularly for the lower levels. So I probably advise, or next year I would script it a little bit before I go in, but I was pretty unprepared, so I just had to go off the cuff. All right, hope you enjoyed that. Please let me know in the comments what you think.
The Motivated Classroom Podcast.